Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of Stitching Tales. I am Johanna Lundström, the owner of the sewing company The Last Stitch, where I create sewing books, sewing patterns, sewing courses, and lots of other helpful content around sewing.
And my name is Malena, and I am a freelance pattern maker living in northern Sweden, and I create PDF pattern under the name Hazelhen Patterns.
And today we're going to do a continuous episode from the last week where we talked about how to sew knit pants, for instance, joggers and leggings. So if you haven't listened to that episode, we highly recommend that you go back and listen to it, because there we address the basics such as picking the right fabric, picking the right elastic, and also how to cut fabric properly. This is a topic that we're both very interested in because we both love to wear and sew knit pants. And Malena, right, you have a pattern as well for knits?
Yeah, my pattern is named Fieldfare joggers, and it's joggers for in women's sizes, and then there are a kids version as well, and a baby version also.
And I also have one sewing pattern currently out, which is for leggings, the Aila leggings. And hopefully when you're listening to this episode, my next sewing pattern will be out, the Vide knit pants, which is a dressier take on knit pants you can also wear in the office for a more polished look. So if the link is in the description section, you know that the pattern is out. And if it's not, it's definitely going to be out in a day or two. That's just the reality. So behind the scenes stuff, sometimes we can't promise everything to be, we're pre-recording this episode. But so that's really exciting. We're definitely going to do a follow-up episode to talk more about that pattern launch as well, if you're curious to know what goes on behind the scenes of launching a new sewing pattern, which is definitely not a straightforward process. It's a lot of small and big things that goes into that. So yeah, Malena, when we finished off last week, we talked about, materials and cutting and everything like that. But now I think we're going to move on to actually sewing the knit pants. And what step would you recommend that we start with from your perspective?
Well, first a question like sewing machine, regular sewing machine, or an overlocker. My opinion is you can use either or. I mean, obviously, if you have an overlocker, use that. It's so much more beneficial when you are sewing with knits. But you can, of course, also sew it with a regular sewing machine. You just have to adjust the type of seam that you use. So it's a stretchy seam. Since the fabric obviously is stretchy, then the seam also needs to be stretchy. And there you can use, the basic regular zigzag. You can do so much with that, but there are also more specific different type of seams that are really nice looking, like a fake overlock seam and such on the sewing machine that you can use. Those are you don't want to mess up with them because it is a nightmare to unpick.
Yeah,
but they look very nice and very durable as well.
Yeah, they look very similar, in fact, if you similar to what a serger or an overlock machine could achieve, for sure. But yeah, I totally agree with you. Also, when you say zigzag stitch, we should perhaps mention that it's not a good idea perhaps to use the regular wider zigzag stitch. Instead, you can reduce the width of the zigzag stitch, so it still has a triangle shape, but it's much more flatter compared to a regular zigzag stitch, because that way you won't get the gaps, but you will still get enough stretch. And why shouldn't we use a straight stitch, right, when we're sewing with knits on a sewing machine, Malena?
Yeah, because you can try this yourself, and you should always try when you choose your seam that it's suitable for your fabric. That when you sew a seam and you pull the fabric, is the seam gonna crack then because it's like too stiff? It doesn't have any stretch in it, or is it like stretchy enough so it has like the equal amount of stretch as the fabric? So if you sew with a just straight stitch, it will break because that seam is stiffer compared to the fabric. So if you choose any sewing, like any seam on a regular sewing machine, try it out on a test, like scrap fabric, do it in 2 layers because you are going to sew in 2 layers, and then pull pretty hard, I would say, because then you really see if the seam is gonna hold or if it's gonna break.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And I think, generally speaking, unless the fabric is incredibly stable, I think you're definitely gonna need to have to use some type of stretch stitch that has some type of stretch, especially in the crotch area as well, because you're gonna pull that up and down. And if the seam pops, it's not gonna be a nice nice way of having like an open seam in the back crotch or something like that. I should also mention a side note, which I've started to experiment, is using stretch thread for a regular sewing machine. Metler is one brand.
I was going to ask you. Yeah, I never used one. What are your experiences?
Yeah, so far, when I made one of the samples for the Vide knit pants, for instance, when I sew darts on knits, I always use a narrow zigzag stitch because, again, the fabric will be pulled, so you don't want to... a straight stitch might be a little bit risky in that case, and but I did experiment now using almost a straight stitch and the stretch thread, and it did pass the pull test, as you say, so it looks promising, I would say. I need to give it time, right, because now I just sewn a sample that I just wore for the photo shoot, but during wear I will get a more like a better idea of exactly how well it holds up. But I definitely, if you are having just a regular sewing machine, and the stretch thread, as the name implies, it looks like just a regular sewing spool, but the fabric has a little bit of the thread, has a little bit of stretch, which means that the risk for popping is less. But I still feel like maybe you should opt for a narrow zigzag stitch rather than an entire straight stitch. But it definitely it seems promising for sure. Yeah.
Sounds interesting. How is it price-wise compared to regular threads?
It's more expensive. I don't remember top of mind, but yeah, it's a little bit more expensive. But it can be worth it, especially for those where you want to have that more of a straighter seam. I think that's where I would recommend it, and you can just use regular polyester universal thread for the other seams if you find it too cost prohibitive.
Yeah, but sounds because, for example, if you want to do top stitchings or on pockets, or if you just want to do the hem with one, you don't have a nice cover lock or something, then I mean these types of threads sounds like perfect.
Yeah, and they do come in a lot of colorways too, so you will be able to find a decent matching thread, I think. I think the Metler brand is probably the biggest one, but I'm sure there are more out there as well. And again, as we always say, you listeners, you have so much experience, so please share over on our YouTube channels, Stitching Tales Pod, or our Instagram account, Stitching Tales Pod, because we would love to hear your experience if you've tried stretch thread and other ways of experience when it comes to sewing knits on a regular sewing machine. So yeah, those are probably the best options: a narrow zigzag stitch or a fake overlock stitch on a sewing machine. And Malena, if we have a serger, what type of stitch should we use then? Do you recommend?
Well, for me, when I use the serger, it's just the regular serger seam, like nothing. I usually don't need to make any advanced adjustments or anything. I always do a test as usual, because then I want to check if the foot pressure is if it's good or not, because the risk here is that is if it's thick fabric or something, that it really, the seam gets stretched out when you sew it. Usually you can get it back if you steam it afterwards, if you steam the seam. But I mean, obviously, if you can adjust the pressure a little bit to help it prevent from being stretched out, I mean, that's of course a good idea.
And when you say a regular overlock stitch, you mean the 2 needle overlock stitch, right? Because you do have a few options. You can use the 1 needle overlock stitch, and you can use the 2 needle overlock stitch.
Yeah, no, I always use 2 needles, so it's like 4 threads in total, and especially on trousers, since I mean, you're pulling them up when you get dressed, and especially if you work out in your trousers, like there are going to be a lot of stress on those seams, so you want them to be as sturdy and durable as possible to avoid, you know, them from breaking or anything.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. So those are the basics when it comes to the seams, and we should also perhaps address hemming, because if pants will require hem unless there is a cuff down at the edge of the hem. So what type of seams could we use for hemming knit pants?
Yeah, I mean, an easy way is to use cuffs, because a cuff is so much easier to sew than to hem a pair of pants. It's, yeah, I mean, of course you can hem it as well, but it's always a little bit trickier to get it nice on stretchy fabrics. If you have a cover machine, great, that will give you a really nice seam. Otherwise, a 2-needle seam is also looks nice. It's a little bit trickier to get it nice. It's usually the under thread is usually the tension is like so tight, so it can pull the seam together, and you get a little like bump in between those two needles. And I always said twin needles are like, it's not my friend. They're quite expensive, they break easily, and I come across a lot of problems when using my 2 needles. So it's not a twin needle, it's called, right? Twin needle.
Twin needle, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so it's not my favorite. But you use you have another favorite hemming method.
Yeah, I do actually. Again, I agree with you. A twin needle is not ideal. It's definitely an option if you don't have a cover stitch machine, because you do get the stretch out of it. But as you say, Malena, you will get that little bump or ridge in between. It's really difficult to get a flat twin needle seam. But it works because it has stretch. So at least that's a bonus. But my favorite way, if you're doing knit pants and not having cuffs, but the knit pants are made of more stable fabrics, such as sweatshirt fabric or French terry or Ponte di Roma double knit fabrics, I like to use the regular machine blind hem stitch, which I would say pretty much all modern sewing machine has this, which, unless you're familiar with it, it sews I think about 3 straight stitches and then a zigzag stitch, 3 straight stitches and then a zigzag stitch, and that zigzag stitch catches, just like you would do a hand sewn invisible seam, it catches the inside of the fabric. And if you're able to align this properly and use a thread that matches the fabric exactly, you will be able to get a seam that is almost or entirely invisible on the outside. Sometimes you get tiny little dots on the outside, but they are not really visible unless you look up close, and you will see that on ready-to-wear garment fabrics as well that are sewn. And you also have that option on a serger as well. You can use the blind hem as well, but then you get like tiny like ladders or straight stitches. It's going to be a bit more visible, I think, than on a regular sewing machine. And when I do that, I should also say that I first serge the edges using a 3-thread overlock stitch. So I just overcast the edges, and then, because then I get this really nice, neat finish, and that serger thread hides the straight seam and straight stitch, the blind hem stitch. And also my sewing machine, which is I think it's over 30 years old, it doesn't have it, but most modern sewing machine also have a knit blind hem stitch, which is, instead of 3 straight stitches and a wide zigzag stitch, it has 3 narrow zigzag stitches and 1 large zigzag stitch. So that's even stretchier. But I haven't tried that myself because I don't have it on my machine, but that could be an option if your fabric is very stretchy. And just like with everything else, practice is what you need to do. It won't be easy the first time. And I should definitely link to it, because I have resources both on my blog and a YouTube video where I really show exactly how to achieve a truly invisible stitch. So it's definitely something you can practice. But I, for instance, now, or the Vide pants that I'm launching, hopefully today, is I used the blind hem stitch, machine blind hem stitch, for all the samples, and it looks so nice, so nice.
Yeah, it's perfect for those thicker fabric because, as you said, it won't. I mean, it will really be invisible from the outside. So that's a great option. And I can recommend, if you like a last resort, like you don't have a cuff, the twin needle, you don't have a cover stitch, the blind hem is not working, then you can do. It has a different name. I think an N fold. I think it's called.
Yeah.
So you basically fold the bottom hem so it becomes like an N. We will add a picture to this on our Instagram, and then you can just sew it on the overlocker. Like you don't even need to cut away any fabric, and it doesn't matter if you accidentally cut away a little bit of the fabric. And after you had sewn that, then it just becomes basically like, it looks like a small mini cuff, basically. Yeah. So it's a really convenient way of hemming really, like, you know, those thin sportswear or like athletic wear, the thin
jerseys,
fabrics.
like,
Yeah, those can be really tricky to hem. So an end fold could be really convenient then.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a really good tip, and there are lots of ways actually, because you might only think, you know, that you need to have a twin needle, but as a, you know, the serger actually has two options. First, as I mentioned, the blind hem, and also, as you say, the end fold. So if you have a serger, you actually also have a hemming machine, which I don't really think that everyone is aware of. You maybe only think that you use it to finish the edges and sew together garments, but there are actually some nice options for that as well. And you can also, a little bit more advanced technique is to fold it and then use the flat lock seam, so you get like it look almost like a flat lock hemming on the outside, using a folding technique which I show in my book Sewing Activewear, which also I highly recommend if you want to learn more about this stuff as well. So you do have more options than you might initially think, which is because hemming is probably the trickiest part when it comes to sewing knits in general, I think. Would we say?
Yeah, it is. Totally agree. That's why we have cuffs.
Yeah, that's why we have cuffs. I love that. Anytime, I think it's a good way, you know, every time you're struggling, regardless if you're sewing a top or a t-shirt or a pair of pants or whatever, you know, add a cuff and then you will have so much less headache. So those were the basic stuff, I think. As you say, great point there about, you know, sewing machine and serger seams. So you don't need a serger, but it's definitely helpful, and I think also it's so fast, right? So I think if you're really you know, discovering the joy of sewing knits, if you have the budget, I do think that getting a serger will you know, be a huge benefit long term. Would you agree with me, Malena?
Yeah, definitely. And I've loved my overlocker. I don't remember the exact name now, but it's a Bernette. They're really old, like it's 20 years something old, and it's just like I love it. I always recommend Bernina, both sewing machine and overlocker.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think invest in a good brand. Sometimes you can get these in like grocery stores and whatnot, but I definitely recommend getting, and you can get a used one as well. As Malena say, these kind of machines, they hold up for decades. I have a Baby Lock Imagine, which is very pricey, but also really, really good. So yeah, now we have kind of settled on what type of stitches you should use, and then we should talk a little bit about the assembly process. And I know that we do it a little bit differently, but we'll also show illustrations over at our Instagram account, Stitching Tales Pod, so it will hopefully make a bit more sense when we're talking. It becomes so abstract, right, when we're just, you know, talking words and, you know, can't really show everything. So if the first step, I would say, is if you're having pockets on your knit pants or darts, I would always recommend that you start with those details before sewing any seams. Would you agree with me, Malena?
Yeah, always start with the small details, because it's so much easier to sew when you don't have the entire thing sewn together. And I mean, in some cases, for example, for my joggers, then you have to make the pockets first before you are able to sew the side seam, for example. So yeah, definitely start with it's another thing if it's like a patch pocket on the side, like goes over the side seam, then obviously you need to sew the side seam first. But in general, always start with the details.
Yeah, I agree. And also, even if the patch pocket isn't covering a seam, for instance on the front, I also recommend that you add the patch pocket before you actually start sewing the rest, because it's like you want to, every step should be the easiest as possible, easy, accessible. And you kind of learn that when you are sewing, that you find out that if I start with this, I will have so much less problems, controlling everything. So all those tiny details, I mean, of course, it doesn't matter if you start with a dart or a pocket. But for instance, a side pocket, you should add those pieces, of course, as you say. And also if you have a front pocket, you definitely need to add that first as well. And also then I think here we're going to do a little bit different method, right? So I will, when we have added the details, then we're going to join like the front and back pieces and sew together a crotch. So in what sewing order would you do it, Malena?
Well, for the joggers, I always sew the pocket first, and then the side seam and the inside seam. I always sew them in the same direction because, I mean, the sewing can stretch them out a little bit. So then the seams are stretched out in the same direction, basically, to avoid it from twisting. This is usually not a big issue or problem if you have a good quality fabric. But, I always try to think of this, that always sew things in the same direction, like, for example, from the top to the bottom or the opposite. So I always do that, and then I turn one leg inside out and put it inside the other leg, so you can sew the crotch seam in one continuous seam. Yeah, it's a little bit difficult to explain. As you can see, Johanna is showing a picture here if you're watching the YouTube video.
Yeah, from our excellent book, Fit for Knits, I should say. Shameless plug. Yeah.
But that's the thing, you can sew them in different ways. It's just what are your preference and how do you prefer? Because you sew them usually in a different steps.
I do it exactly the opposite of what you do, and I think what you are explaining also is similar to the traditional way that you're sewing pants in woven, where you first sew the legs and then you join the two pieces of legs together by sewing the crotch seam as in one entire sequence from back to front or from front to back. And also you bring out a great point, sewing in the same direction, which I totally agree with. So what I do is quite a different method. I sew it on the flat instead, and again, as there is no wrong or right way, it's just the way I like my workflow to do. So if you're not familiar with sewing on the flat, for instance, if you have sewn a pair of jeans, you will be familiar with this method, because then you do it on the flat when you insert a zipper. Again, shameless plug for my book Sewing Jeans, because there I show exactly how to do this. But I do the same for knit pants. So what I do first is that I put the two front pieces together, right side facing, and then I sew the front crotch seam. So I join the two front pieces by sewing the front crotch seam. Then I do the exact same on the back pieces. I join the back crotch seam. So I have two flat pieces, one for the front and one to the back. So if I'd sewn the side seam now, it's going to look like a skirt so you can get the picture. And what I do there, again, we should also mention, we should press as we go, Malena. That's your
obviously
soapbox, right?
Yes. Yeah. Can't I forgot to mention it. Press along as you go. Yeah,
so that's very good. For instance, when you're done the outer side seams, you should definitely press them, because before you close the entire leg, because it's going to be so much difficult. Again, it's tricky to press the inseam because then you have already that circle that you need to navigate on your iron board. So it's very, very important to do the pressing as soon as you sew in a seam. For easy access, press it. So that's what I do with the as I mentioned, the front and the back crotch. So I press those flat. So that's why I like this method, because I'm able to press the crotch really flat because I have just the 2 pieces. And what I do also then is that I press them in opposite direction. So when I join them, I won't have that extra layer. So it's going to lie really flat. And then
I was going to ask you that.
yes, I'm very. Yes, I'm very particular about that, and if you get my Vide pants sewing pattern, you will see the instructions that I'm talking about, and if you get Malena's Fieldfare joggers, you will get the instruction that she is talking about. So you have 2 different options, but basically doing the same thing.
But what are the benefits with pressing the crotch in different direction?
Because you don't get the chafing at the crotch, because obviously, you know, especially if the pants are a little bit more tight fitting, you don't want to have like a thick layer, because you do essentially you have 4 seams joining together, like the in seams of 2 pieces and then the crotch, so you don't want to have that big bump, you know, rubbing in your crotch. So that's why I like to do that. So always try to keep everything flat as possible for
and it's
comfort.
going to be so much easier when you sew it as well, because you don't have that bump to the presser foot might get stuck into, and then the presser feet are pulling, everything gets stretched out, and it's just so much easier when it's a little bit smoother for the machine as well to work with.
Very, very good point, because the serger, it doesn't do well with especially a serger and a sewing machine, it doesn't really do well with bumps. It's gonna get stuck, and you can have issues with feeding. You can get really, really tight seams because you can't, like, it needs force to go over that hump. So that's a great tip in general. Try to reduce bulk as much as possible.
Yeah, and if you have, I mean, you're always going to have a little bit of bulk to completely avoid it. Then if you sew with, an overlocker, just take it slow when you come to that part and stop. Tiny lift up with your finger, lift up the presser foot at the foot end that is towards you. Help out the fabric, push a little bit, and then it's going to get so much easier to sew.
Yeah. Very good tip, because that's definitely a struggle area for sure. And then I do what you do. I sew the outer seams first, and then I press, of course. And also, if you have pockets, press the seam towards the back, right? Because otherwise you will get a second layer. It's going to be quite bumpy, that seam anyways, right? Because you have the pocket, and you usually have like several different pocket pieces, so it's going to be thick. So always press that seam to the back. Would you agree with me, Malena, when it comes to?
Yeah, I think you can use that as a general rule, basically, for in which direction should you press the seam allowance. It's like the way that it is the easiest, because as you said, you will have so many layers with the pockets. So then to press them towards the front, all those layers have to be folded towards the front. And that's just going to create extra bulk, and at the end, when you wear it, you wash it, it's still going to want to turn back because, again, it's so many layers. So always press where it feels most natural and feels the most easiest. That's usually how it's going to be best when you wear it and wash it, and it's going to be more natural for the garment.
Yeah, good. Yeah, I totally agree. And then I sew the inseams, and what I do then, of course, is that I actually sew them in one continuous sequence. So this is why we're going to have illustrations now, because for both the method we're describing here. So I start at one leg opening, of course, with the right side facing, the wrong side out. I start from one leg opening, and then I sew one continuous seam all the way up. And then, of course, I make sure that the front and back crotch seams align, so I get that nice. I don't want them to slip, so I usually stop and check before I serge over it. Again, as I said, with the fold allowance flipped in opposite directions, and then I sew all the way down to the other leg opening. So this method I really like, but again, both, when you wear it, and you won't see any difference. It's just that the seams will slip a little bit different, but you both get a good comfort. So it's really just your preference, I would say. I can't really make a strong argument for why my method is better. It's just that I like to do this better than
yeah, no, both works. So you can do either or. It's just a matter of preference, as I say. One question I have, if you go back to the pockets, I usually don't have any stabilizers when I sew the pocket opening. How do you do?
Yeah, good point. Yes, I always stabilize. I use fusible interfacing because it can be a little bit tricky, especially if you have like using a sewing machine, or if the pocket is cut on the slanted, so you have more stretch. There is always a risk of getting gaping pockets just because you're working with such a soft fabric. So I always stabilize, and I just use a strip of lightweight fusible interfacing, so that the end of the slanted front pockets and side seams pockets, I do the same. It will have very minimal stretch, because I don't feel that the pocket needs to have a lot of give, because the fusible we cut slightly on the bias, there will be a slight stretch, just because you cut it on the bias slightly. So that's how I do it. And again, we show this method in our book Fit for Knits, and I'm holding it up now. If you're watching the YouTube version, you can see here. If you see it here, I stabilize the front opening of it if you have a slanted pocket. But again, Malena, you don't, and I've sewn your without, so it's basically again a preference thing. What are your thoughts about that?
No, but I agree. It's I usually don't because I'm lazy and I don't actually have those kind of fusible with me. If I had stretchy fusing, I think I would definitely do it, because when you have your hands in your pockets, the openings, they do get a little bit stretched out because it's a lot of stress on those seams. So I would recommend it. And again, it depends a little bit on the fabric as well. Like if you have more fabric with good recovery, it's not as sensitive because then it is gonna recover a little bit better. But yeah, no, I don't do it, but I definitely recommend that you do it. Have you ever, just curious, have you ever used like a silicone tape to stabilize it?
No, I haven't actually. I've used it obviously as for shoulder seams and for necklines, but I have not tried it for you don't even need to use a stretch fusible, because when you cut it slightly on the bias, it's going to have so for instance you can use like blouse fusible, blouse lightweight, and when you cut it slightly on the bias, you will still get just a tiny amount of stretch. So no, I haven't. And of course, again, we would love to hear your thoughts about this. You who are listening to this episode, what have you found has worked for you when it comes to keep the pockets in place? And again, it all depends, I guess, on the type of style that you're sewing as well. I mean, if you just want to make a pair of casual joggers, to me, it doesn't really matter too much if things are stretched out because it's such a casual style. But if you want to do more of a dressier version and you have this slanted pocket, then I definitely recommend that you stabilize it just to keep that flat shape, because pockets will grow. Definitely, because you're going to use them, hopefully.
Yeah, that's a good point. And something that I can recommend is when you have, again, it depends a little bit how kind of pocket you have, but if you have them in the side seam and that they are like slightly slanted, so they goes a little bit on the front bottom piece, I usually, when I've sewn the pocket, the outer pocket bag, I usually don't use, if I'm sewing a sweatshirt or sweatshirt fabric, I usually have a thinner outer pocket bag then, just because to avoid too much bulk. So I use, like, for example, a t-shirt fabric, a little bit sturdier t-shirt fabric maybe. And then when I've sewn them together, I usually add stitching, like top stitching, not on the outside, but on the inside on the pocket bag. So I how do you say, I fixate the seam allowance so it doesn't start to turn. You can do it also through all layers, so you will have a visible top stitching on the pocket opening. Again, matter of preference just, but that could be something good also to avoid the pocket bags from like starting to turn out so you see the inside. Do you have any, do you do that? Or?
I do the same. I think it's called understitching or something like that. Where you do, it's similar what you do. If you look in older sewing books, you will see when you're doing a facing and stuff like that, that you stitch on the inside just to prevent the facing from flipping out. It's a similar technique. And also...
Yeah, exactly.
I do the same. And also for the Vide pants, I have a method. I hope this is going to resonate well. I'm a little bit nervous because I'm basically launching a completely new way of doing this on this pattern. But just like you do, I recommend that you, for the pocket piece that is facing the outside, that you use a more lightweight fabric. You can use like a t-shirt scrap, an old t-shirt, whatever. It's just a nice, stable cotton jersey. And I also do the same thing. I understitch it just to keep it in place. And I think that's a really good point, because you don't want it, especially if you're using a contrasting fabric. And of course, why not use all same garment fabric? As you say, Malena, if you're using like a heavy sweatshirt fabric, you're gonna essentially have 3 layers: the outer layer of the pants, the outer pocket bag lining, and then the inner one. So you have 3 layers plus seam allowances. So unless they're very roomy, you're going to have a lot of pockets showing through. And you can also see that if you go into a store and check out a lot of pants that are ready-made, ready to wear, you will see that they don't use self fabric or garment fabric for all the pocket pieces, because it's just too much bulk, especially if you're using a heavier fabric. So that's why we do it. And if you get my Vide pants, you can definitely also use, of course, self fabric. But the reason why is I just do it to avoid bulk. So yeah, again, it's a preference thing. But I think this is why it's so fun to do this episode, because we definitely address a little bit more like advanced techniques. I think sometimes we simplify so much for when people are sewing, but having like a next level understanding, I definitely think can be helpful to achieve that really, really nice, clean look on stuff.
Yeah, no, that's why I think explaining something like why do we do it in a certain way is so helpful, because then you can take your own conscious decision, like, I know that you can do it in this way, but it's going to work equally fine for me in this particular case. So you can really decide for yourself what's the best best option for you. And I seen a lot of people that have the inner pocket bag. They use also a sweatshirt fabric, but maybe use a contrast color on that one, so it gives a little pop as well. So I mean, you can really play around here. And in these cases, if you are going to mix different types of fabric, yes, now I really recommend that you pre-wash them, because if they shrink differently, I mean, pocket bags, they are not that big, so it's not going to give that big effect. But if one of the fabric is shrinking a lot more, then yeah, it's not gonna be good afterwards. So here I do recommend always to pre-wash them.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And then once we've done all the pants, now we go over to the waistband, because what we're talking about now is usually a traditional waistband. Now we're talking most about joggers, but we also, of course, there's legging as well. But I think we're going to have time to just address the waistband now for the joggers. So when we have these pieces, usually there's a front and back piece, or this is one single piece. If there's one single piece of the waistband, where would you recommend that we place the seam then, if there's only one seam?
I usually place them the seam at the side, just because it's gonna be less visible. in my opinion. You can of course also place it center back or center front. I mean, it's just a matter of opinion. For me, I always place them in the side just because they become less visible, and especially for my baby joggers, then it's like a really wide cuff at the waist. I don't have any elastic there. It's just a really wide ribbed cuff, and then I especially recommend that you always place that seam at the side, because if the baby is lying on the back and then you have like thick overlock seam allowance, I mean, pushing in the back, it's not going to be as comfortable. So then that's why I always recommend it to be placed in the side. But of course, again, it's a matter of opinion. It's not like right or wrong. It's just where do you prefer to place it?
Yeah, and some like to place it in the back as well. I personally like to keep that's for me, it's just a visual thing. I just like it, I don't mind the back crotch seam obviously, but to me, having that back seam, I think it kind of draws the attention to that seam. So I would do the same as you and place it on the side as well, because you always have your arms covering it. It's even if you if you like put your sweater or your top inside the waistband, because if it's in the side, it will not be visible, but obviously it will be if you put it in the back. But again, do you. And also, I remember I forgot to skip one step, and that is how to assemble the waistband. If you have either, it doesn't matter if you have one or two seams. I know, Malena, you like to use straight stitch, right? Like a
I mean, even if you have a really stretchy fabric, like if you use a rib, sometimes you can use the self fabric as well, but this seam is like, it's so short, it's like 2 inches long, or like 10 centimeters long. I mean, you're not going to pull that seam so much. So here, if you just sew it with a straight stitch, and then you can press open the seam allowance, so it will be also less bulky. I usually do that. Here, to use the zigzag, it's not that, the seam is not going to be stressed, like pulled so much. So here you get by with using a shorter straight stitch, because then it still has a little bit of give. If you use long stitch length, then it's easier to break, but a shorter one, it's good enough.
Yeah, that's a good point. And the advantage of using that instead of an overlock stitch, what I occasionally do, is that you can press the seam allowance flat, because then you have just joined it, and then you can so you will again have a much less bulk, because you will have the struggle regardless where you place the seams or the waistband. You will have a lot of intersecting seams and layers of fabric. So anything you can do to reduce it, it's definitely helpful. So you bring up a really good point there. You can of course use an arrow zigzag as well, but I think I'm definitely more inclined now to move towards using that method as well, where you always press the seam allowance open instead, just because you get such a flat waistband that way. And a lot of rib knits, if you're using that, they don't really have any lengthwise stretch. It's actually quite common that they only have crosswise stretch. So there's very, very little risk that you will have the fabric stretch out as well when you're joining the seams that way. So again, in our book Fit for Knits, we show both methods, but that's definitely a helpful tip to use that instead. But I think
one benefit I can say with using the straight stitch is, I show this on my Fieldfare joggers. This is 2 different ways of attaching the waistband to the trousers, and I think we show both of them in our books, right? I can't remember what Johanna is showing now. So the reason why I prefer to use a straight stitch here when you sew together the waistband is because then I can leave a little bit of a gap on one side. So I sew like just 1 centimeter, I leave a 3 centimeters gap, for example, and then I continue sewing. So when you fold the waistband and when you start attaching it to the trouser, you will actually have a little bit of a hole in your waistband. And then you can put your elastic band through that little hole. And if you want to, then of course, after you finished everything, you can close up that hole by hand, or do as me, leave it open, and you will be able to adjust the elastic very easily in the future if needed. Here, like, being lazy and not finishing everything is actually a benefit.
Yeah, it's a very good idea. And sometimes, you will either encounter that you realize when you wear it that your elastic, you didn't quite fit it quite right. So then you definitely, it's nice to adjust it. Because I usually do the other method, which we also show in the book, where I instead leave a stop. I don't sew the entire waistband to the legs. I leave a slight opening, just like you would with a woven pair of pants for inserting. Then I just insert the elastic, and then I just join the remaining piece of the waistband to the legs afterwards. And both the what I like about that method is it's very quick and easy. But that means if I realize that I need to adjust the elastic, it's going to be a bigger headache, because then I have to rip open the waistband seam, which unfortunately, especially when you're sewing, when you might encounter a few issues. And I'm actually going to hold up now the sample of Vide pants. In my instructions, I show the method where I talked about, but I'm also doing a sew along, a photo illustration on the blog for the Vide pants, and then I show the method which you are describing, Malena. We both, as I said, we both show it in our book Fit for Knits. But I actually managed to, so we're gonna see, yeah. So afterwards, because there will be an opening, but I just used slip stitching. So, which is like a tiny stitch where it's almost invisible when you join the seam. So if you're watching the YouTube version here, you can see, if I pull it apart, you can see that it's hand sewn, but you won't see the opening. And if I realize now that I want to adjust the elastic, I will do this, rip open the seam in just a couple of minutes, and then I can just do it. So I think that's an option as well. If you want to hide the elastic, you can just close it with a little bit of hand sewing.
Yeah, so it's good to have, I mean, both these methods, they work equally well. It's just a matter of preferences. When you leave a hole in the waistband, you can then sew the waistband in one continuous seam when you attach it to the trousers, which I think gives a nice inside. But I mean, obviously, it's on the inside, so it's that from the outside, it's going to be exactly the same both methods. So it's just a matter of preferences, like what do you prefer to do?
Yeah. So hopefully we managed to give you a good idea on these things. And if not, definitely go over to our Instagram account, Stitching Tales Pod. We're definitely going to show some illustrations and photos of the methods that we're talking about right now. And of course, also, if you want to learn more about both fitting and sewing knit pants, we highly recommend that you go out and get our book, Fit for Knits, where we talk about all the things that we have addressed in this episode, plus lots more, especially when it comes to fitting, which is a totally different topic. And that's why
we mentioned in the book, we mentioned how to also attach, if you have a leggings, then you don't usually have a waistband cuff, basically. You sew it to the trouser directly, so we show that as well. And because there are different ways, and you also show how you, on your Aila leggings, for example, you have a really wide waistband, so then you show as well how to sew that, because then you have a smaller elastic to the top waist seam, right?
Exactly. So where I just add the elastic in the seam allowance, which we addressed in the previous episode. And as Malena mentioned, we haven't really talked about so much the fold over, where you attach the elastic on the inside and then you fold it over and top stitch over it, which I'm holding up the Fit for Knits books as well here, where we show this method as well. So you have at least 3 different options, and maybe 4, because as you say, you can also, especially on babies, you might if you have a sturdy rib knit, you could actually perhaps skip the elastic and just use a very firm rib knit to keep it in place as well. So again, it goes a little bit on what the uses and of course what type of fabric. So you have lots of different options, I think, and so hopefully you got some helpful ideas on this. As we say, it's very difficult to talk about this in words when it's such a visual thing, but we want to make sure that you get those like extra tips, right? Because it's not easy. I mean, when we're doing sewing patterns as well, we need to simplify because there's also a risk of information overload. So for instance, I can't show like 3 or 2 different methods for everything. That doesn't mean that I'm not saying that you can do it differently, which is why it's so good that we both are doing it differently, and also we're able to address that there's not just one way of doing things. Just because we show one method in the sewing instruction doesn't mean that we say you have to do it like that, right?
Yeah, no, and also depends on what kind of material you have. For example, if you have a little bit softer elastic that easily is rolling inside the waistband tunnel, then I always recommend to sew a straight stitch, I mean, how do you say, like vertical along like the side seam, center front, center back maybe even, then that elastic won't start turning when you wash it or when you wear it. But if you have a sturdier elastic, then maybe you don't need to do that because it's gonna stay in place even after washing. So it really depends, like certain method requires because of certain materials, for example, or just personal preferences, of course.
Yeah. As you say, I think it's called like the sewing jargon is stitch in the ditch, where you when you top stitch the elastic, for instance, if you have side seams on the waistband on both sides, you can actually stitch it there, or if the back, but you might need to stitch it also a couple of places where you don't have a seam. But the great thing about stitching in the ditch is that if you stitch a straight stitch inside the seam, it will be completely invisible. So a stitch in the ditch is a great technique to use for a lot of things, I think, because it's just an invisible seam that keeps things in place.
Yeah, and if you have the waistband is made in like a rib fabric or something, just pull the fabric a little bit apart and try to stitch in one of those like basically natural ditches in the rib structure. So then it will also be like barely visible. Yeah.
I think we brought up some really good points today, and hopefully you as a listener again found this episode helpful. Of course, don't forget to check out our sewing patterns, and we will link those in the description section as well, both your joggers and my leggings, and hopefully also my new sewing pattern, the Vide knit pants. So thank you so much for listening, and I am Johanna Lundström.
I am Malena Hjerpe. Bye bye.
Bye bye.